Remixing is a fraught practice. Of all the infinite ways a track can be mixed or remixed, it only comes out one particular way in any given iteration. This reader represents one particular take on how the field of trans studies could be remixed. Remixing requires cutting. Some of the source material that could have gone into this mix simply didn't make the cut, not because they're not good or no longer relevant, but simply because they don't fit the structure or rhythm we sought. Even the included essays were in many cases pared down to amplify the connections between essays in a given section, trans studies as a field, and the remix as a collection. This was exciting work to undertake, but also imbued with feelings of loss. One of the hardest parts of putting the Transgender Studies Reader Remix together was everything we had to leave out from the first 2 volumes. There are brilliant and important pieces there, written not just by an earlier generation of scholars, but by amazing colleagues still active in the field who are producing vital and timely work. We urge readers who want to take a deeper and more expansive dive into the field not to neglect the content of those earlier volumes. This one does not replace them. Remixing involves not only loss but risk, particularly with regard to how it samples materials from genres with significantly different cultural and socio-political origins. It is weighted with the possibility that it may appropriate rather than respectfully recognize difference. Is it appropriative to juxtapose Black feminist work or work from the Global South or Indigenous work that never imagined itself as doing trans studies with work originating in Anglophone trans studies in the Global North that is so often unmarked as white? Or is doing so a way of changing what transgender means and what transing does by bringing trans studies into older, deeper, and broader problematics, especially those that actively shape emergent trans of color critique and trans scholarship as a whole? Is it offering trans methodologies for recasting how the body means to others who might find those methods useful? Rhythms and Vibrations, a remix of trans thinking. The Transgender Studies Reader Remix, like each of the previous volumes, contains 50 chapters. They're organized into 10 sections of 5 chapters. Each section revolves around a central theme or topic, and we imagine the pieces chosen as all somehow talking with one another within and across sectional boundaries. As noted, this represents one particular take on how these articles can be put into conversation. We invite readers who spend time with the entire volume to notice how the works could be rearranged into other conversations and how they speak to one another across as well as within the sections as we've arranged them. The first section, Trans Feminisms, pays attention to the central role that feminisms have had in transgender studies. It positions Sandy Stone's The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, as a point of departure for the field. When Stone issued her manifesto, the word transgender was not yet in widespread use, but it came to name the space of imaginative, critical, and theoretical possibility that Stone envisioned when she called upon like-minded, gender-changing people to go beyond the limits imposed by the psychopathologizing discourse of transsexuality. Stone's title referenced Janice Raymond's book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male. Raymond was one of the first TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, and she targeted Stone, a trans woman then working as a recording engineer as part of the all-lesbian Olivia Records collective. We include Sappho by Surgery from Raymond's book as a representative example of the kind of transphobic feminism that has generated a robust trans-feminist counter-response. One such work is A Transvestite Answers a Feminist, by gay trans man Lou Sullivan, later an important activist and now something of a cult icon for many contemporary trans masculine people. Written before his transition when he still identified as a heterosexual female transvestite, Sullivan offers a contemporaneous trans masculine critique of second-wave feminism frameworks hostile to transing gender. We then move beyond the United States with Karen Espinera and Sam Bourcier's chapter, Transfeminism, Something Else, Somewhere Else, which traces the development of transfeminism in France, transfeminismas, and Spain, transfeminismo. Daniel B. Coleman, in Transmasculine Insurgency, explores how location and feminist sociocultural formations rooted in different racial ethnic communities and Latinx contexts work in relation to trans life. As these authors show, transfeminism, a term coined by disability and sex work activist Emi Koyama, emerges and is enacted differently across context. Trans Matters, Black Matters remixes another foundational work in transgender studies, Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, performing transgender rage, with recent work in Black trans studies, Trans of Color Critique, a classic work of Black feminism, and feminist science studies work on materiality. Stryker uses the figure of the monster to explore how the attribution of transness can expel one from human community, while simultaneously enabling an empowering connection to a primordial ontological state, the darkness of the chaotically generative cosmological void from which all existence spills forth. We pair this with Marquis Bay's The Transness of Blackness, the Blackness of Transness, which develops a nuanced sense of how Black racial fugitivity and gender transness trace different roots toward the same and original lawlessness of a groundless state of being from which difference emerges. Hortense J. Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, is part of the genealogy of both contemporary Black feminisms and trans studies that Bay draws from and extends. Slavery and its afterlife have attenuated the possibility of Black women's inclusion in the white patrilineal ordering of gender, Spillers contends, and, in a move that preceded and informed Stryker's articulation of a white transgender monstrosity enlivened by darkness, she asks Black women to forego attempts to belong to a racialized gender ordering that will never serve them and, instead, to formulate a new insurgent ontological ground. Other selections in the section include Transmaterialities, Trans Matter Realities, and Queer Political Imaginings, in which feminist science studies scholars Karen Barad brings a physicist perspective to bear on the materiality of the cosmological void and puts quantum field theory into dialogue with work in queer and trans theory. A selection from Zakiya Amen Jackson's Theorizing in a Void offers a nuanced engagement with the possibilities for rupture from racial hierarchies encoded into notions of gender and the human, thus completing a circuit between Black feminisms, trans studies, and science studies. The coloniality of transgender addresses how currently dominant ways of thinking about sex gender are a part of an ongoing practice of European colonialization. This practice not only works through the assumption that there are two kinds of bodies, sexes, and two categories of people, genders, but the even more fundamental assumption that body difference is a naturally given way of assigning people to social categories. We open with Salish Wesley's Twin-Spirited Woman, in which a contemporary Indigenous trans and two-spirit woman asks her grandmother, a powerful matriarch of the traditionally matrilineal, matrifocal, Stolo people, to dream a name in their native language for the kind of person Wesley knew herself to be. Doing so was a profound enactment of Indigenous survivance, asserting the power of a living creature to imagine in the present a part of itself that had been erased and suppressed through colonial violence. Post-colonial feminist philosopher Maria Lugones' The Coloniality of Gender provides a theoretical scaffolding for the rest of the work in this section and highlights how the somatocentricity of the Eurocentric colonial world order installed a modern colonial gender system that divides people according to physical difference and expunges the multiple genders and gender roles that previously appeared in many pre-modern Indigenous and non-Western gender systems. Deborah Miranda's Extermination of the Joyas, Gendercide in Spanish California, offers a detailed account of how two-spirit people in her own ancestral culture were explicitly targeted by Spanish colonizers as part of an overarching project of cultural destruction and genocide. A short selection from Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera, the new Mestiza, traces the U.S.-Mexico borderlands as a space of constant transition and division, where everyday survival and creative abundance take shape at once. She writes the connections between the racial and ethnic mixing that characterizes the U.S.-Mexican borderlands in the place of queer and trans people amid border space. A final piece by Anaretta Dutta and Reina Roy, Decolonizing Transgender in India, Some Reflections, highlights the need to bring a decolonial perspective not just to trans studies of the Americas, but globally. It discusses how transgender, as a form of identity, overwrites multiple forms of gender variance present in South Asia and the global South more broadly, and functions as a universal standard against which local variations are measured, even as the term is reworked and embodied in different ways across different transnational contexts. Queer Gender and Its Discontents examines the close and sometimes contentious relationship between trans and queer studies. Queer theory tends to focus on sexuality and desire, and has treated transness as the expression of a queer potential to disrupt heteronormativity. Trans studies, on the other hand, has been more attuned to questions of embodiment and identity, and sees gender as a process of categorizing people that allows desire to take shape and find its aim. We include a selection from Subversive Bodily Acts in Judith Butler's paradigm-shifting Gender Trouble, as well as one from early trans theorist Jay Prosser's critique of queer theory's skewed and partial uptake of trans phenomena in Judith Butler, Queer Feminism, Transgender, and the Transubstantiation of Sex. Jose Esteban Munoz, The White to be Angry, about trans feminine drag artist Vaginal Davis, offers an excellent example of a queer of color disidentificatory approach to gender performativity, while Jack Halberstam's The Transgender Look explores queer gender representation in several important trans-developed or trans-focused films of the 1990s. Trans scholar Cale M. Keegan discusses tensions in how trans studies and queer studies both have, and have not, found institutional homes in academic departments of women's studies in Getting Disciplined, What's Trans About Queer Studies Now? Sexology and Its Critics historicizes and critiques the idea that trans issues are properly in the domain of scientific or medical studies of sexuality. While of course trans people want good health care and might need to talk with doctors and therapists, the idea that there's something inherently pathological about being trans has been a powerful way of controlling and marginalizing trans life since the 19th century. This section includes 2 case studies from late 19th and early 20th century sexual scientists. Case 131, in Richard von Krafft-Ebing's 1877 Psychopathia Sexualis, documents a transmasculine life, while Case 13 in Magnus Hirschfeld's 1910 Transvestites documents a transfeminine life. It's possible to read both case studies against the grain, to recover trans perspectives from them beyond the intent of the doctors. Hirschfeld, a Jewish socialite who was himself gay, is justly remembered for trying to improve the quality of life for trans people through medical science and legal reform. But as 2 other contributors to this section note, the very sexological research into hormonal and surgical techniques that many trans people have found life-saving are also rooted in sexology's often explicit racism and support of eugenics. Kaji Amin's Transplasticity and the Ontology of Race and Species examines how late 19th and early 20th century glandular therapies, now commonly called xenotransplantations, non-human to human transfers of biomatter, functioned as a tool of eugenics and white racial and gender rejuvenation. In The Matter of Gender, Nikki Sullivan explores how the concept of gender itself was first articulated by sexologist John Money and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins as a way of conceptualizing how trans and intersex people could have identities as men and women that did not align in normative ways with their natal genitals. Jules Gill Pearson's Trans of Color Critique Before Transsexuality dives into the archive of the Johns Hopkins University Hospital, which pioneered many of the endocrinological and surgical techniques for altering the genitals of trans and intersex patients to show how the mid-20th century discourse of transsexuality was based on white norms that erased the ways that trans people of color both solicited and evaded the attention of medical science. C. Riley Snowden and Jin Hereta-Warren's Trans Necropolitics opens the next section, Regulating Embodiment. Snowden and Hereta-Warren, in their contribution, draw on post-colonialist theorist Akhil Mbe's reworking of Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics to point out how, for racialized and colonized subjects, the political management of their life is often solely for the purpose of orchestrating their death rather than managing their lives. They show how trans of color death has often been mobilized to enhance white trans life. Relatedly, much of the work in this section is characteristic of the biopolitical turn in trans studies in the early 21st century, when a newly robust national security apparatus took shape amid the War on Terror. Toby Beacham's Artful Concealment and Strategic Visibility, Transgender Bodies and U.S. State Surveillance After 9/11 explores this fairly recent historic shift, while Claire Sears, in Electric Brilliancy, Cross-Dressing Law and Freak Show Displays in 19th Century San Francisco, roots practices of surveilling gender variance in a much deeper history of regulating public space according to white, heterosexual, and able-bodied norms. In Incarceration, Identity Politics, and the Trans-Cis Divide, political scientist Paisley Curra examines the capitalist marketplace logics of incarceration in relation to freeze-time policies that work against trans people's access to health care on the inside, while legal theorist Dean Spade, in Trans Law and Politics on a Neoliberal Landscape, explores the limitations of contemporary rights-based activism as it has taken shape amid massive prison system expansions, growing income inequality, and reductions to social safety net benefits. Historicizing Trans tackles one of the liveliest topics in contemporary trans studies, using trans asterisk methodologies to understand gender variance in the past, before current identity categories and gender concepts existed. The section opens with Leah Devon and Zeb Tortorici's reflection on how we might use trans to develop cross-temporal historical analysis and, conversely, how historical analysis helps us reconsider transness in new ways. Their conceptual framing of trans historicities in Trans, Time, and History likewise helps us to engage trans history writing, from early essays such as Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Liberation, a movement whose time has come, to more recent work in the field. Mary Weisemantel's Towards a Transgender Archaeology, a Queer Rampage Through Prehistory, uses trans theory to suggest how current ideologies of a biological sex-gender binary inform a misreading of the deep human past that serves only to naturalize presentist frames of reference. Other work in this section explores much more recent history. Paul B. Preciado's Pharmacopornographic Regime, Sex, Gender, and Subjectivity in the Age of Punk Capitalism offers a provocative rift on post-World War II techno-science that positions the pharmaceutically altered, hypersexualized trans body as the paradigmatic figure of our historical era. In One Incorporated and Reed Erickson, Aaron H. Dover and Nicholas Matt offer a history of the contentious and largely unremembered support of gay activism by a wealthy trans man from the 1960s to the early 1980s, while Afsana Najmabadi's Reading Transsexuality and Gay Tehran around 1979 documents how trans and gay categories of identity rooted in a Eurocentric frame of reference shifted before and after the Iranian Revolution. Transing the Non-Human begins with the classic work of feminist science studies, Donna J. Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto, which provided a point of departure for her student Sandy Stone's Post-Transsexual Manifesto. Haraway's Cyborg offered a way to rethink many of the binaries that characterize contemporary embodiment: nature, culture, mechanic, organic, human, animal, male, female, non-living, living. Hill Melitino's Biohacking Gender, Cyborgs, Coloniality, in the Pharmacopornographic Era discusses both Haraway and Preciado to suggest that however liberatory it can feel to engage in do-it-yourself practices of body transformation that point to some better post-human cyborgian future, these very frames of reference remain embedded in capitalism and coloniality, an embeddedness that Haraway acknowledges in her work. Mel Y. Chen, in Animals Without Genitals, Race and Transubstantiation, reads representations of genital presence-absence in a variety of cultural texts to show how moments of transness make visible the way race and species operate as categories that create hierarchies between different kinds of life. In Lessons from a Starfish, Eva Hayward similarly reads moments of transness in The Cripple and the Starfish, A song by not yet outist trans artist Ahoni of Antony and the Johnsons to put species difference and disability in conversation with trans studies in ways that open up new ways of thinking about the capacity of life to regenerate itself in new forms. In Trans Animisms, Abram J. Lewis links practices of magic in trans activism to the concept of animism, or ontological liveliness, in the lives and belief systems of two important mid-20th century trans activists, Reed Erickson and Angela Douglas. Rather than idiosyncratic manifestations of strangeness or madness, Lewis shows how this sense of animistic magic has played a central role in trans activism. Making creative work has long been a practice through which trans people remix and reimagine their worlds. The section of transcultural production includes Julian Carter's Embracing Transition or Dancing in the Folds of Time, which uses technical dance terminology and the metaphor of choreography to offer an expansive theorization of how transition can remake the relationships between bodies, time, and space. In Performance and Intravention, Ballroom Culture and the Politics of HIV/AIDS in Detroit, Marlon M. Bailey uses performance ethnography to explore how ballroom and house culture become sites of queer and trans of color survival through creative expressions of gender and community care, while Treva Ellison offers another deeply theorized account of trans of color gender performance as a mode of survival within racial capitalism in The Labor of Working It, the Performance and Protest Strategies of Sir Lady Java. Francesco J. Gallart, in Transgender Chicana Poetics, revisits the cultural production of an earlier generation of Chicana feminism and argues for an expansive joteria that includes trans people. A final selection from Eliza Steenbach, Shimmering Phantasmagoria, approaches trans studies by way of film theory to suggest how transsexuality can be considered a cinematic mode of embodiment. Our last set of texts is organized around the theme of intersectionality and embodiment. The framework of intersectionality, a term coined by critical race theorist Kimberlé Crenshaw and a core concept of contemporary Black feminism, is rooted, by way of Polly Murray, in a genealogy of thought that has both Black and trans non-binary branches. Polly Murray, a lawyer and legal scholar whose theorization of the intersections of misogyny and racism in the experiences of Black women in the southern United States, an apartheid system Murray dubbed Jane Crow, informed not only the concept of intersectionality, but the anti-segregation and reproductive rights rulings of U.S. Supreme Court Justices Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In Polly Murray's Peter Panic, Simon D. Ellen Fisher shows how Murray's non-binary transness foundationally contributed to our understandings of intersectionality from a specifically trans of color perspective. We include another classic work of intersectional Black feminism, the Black Feminist Statement of the Combahee River Collective, for the argument it makes against the biological essentialism it saw in contemporaneous white feminism, precisely the characteristic that underpins feminist transphobia. Two other works take the concept of intersectionality in other directions. Eli Clare's Selection from Brilliant Imperfection, Grappling with Cure, brings a disability studies framework to bear on questions of medically assisted gender transition to critique the ways some able-bodied trans people deploy the pathologizing language of defect to describe their relationships with their genders. In so doing, they disavow disability stigma and imagine treatment as cure in ways that serve only to reproduce ableism. In Hermaphrodites with Attitude, intersex activist Cheryl Chase charts connections and divergences between the intersex and transgender movements in the 1990s while placing medicalized practices of genital cutting in a transnational feminist framework. A final essay, Christopher Joseph Lee's Undetectability in a Time of Trans Visibility, reminds readers of the often unacknowledged centrality of the HIV/AIDS pandemic to the historical context in which trans studies took shape. Fisher repurposes the notion of undetectability, a term which often refers to an undetectable HIV viral load, and uses it to rethink questions of trans of color visibility and vulnerability to premature death through exposure to structural racism and transphobia. We hope that you find a rhythm of your own as you read the remix, whether that's by reading within sections or skipping across them, reading the chapters in order or at random. We developed the remix as a specifically trans project, one that highlights the cross-disciplinary linkages already looping underneath new and old trans studies tracks.